Aaron, it's so great to be here with you, and thank you for coordinating and inviting us to participate. It's just wonderful to be from SBJC up the road, but in everyone's houses. So thank you for that. So I'm going to go on a slightly different tack to my colleagues, Rabbi Eli Tukvasera and Rabbi Monique Meyer, but although possibly picking up on some threads that we've already encountered about Revelation, the complexity and the unknowableness of God and God's revelation, and also the phrase that I saw Monique had, the Haftarei Acha Kamocha, might pop up as well. You shall love your neighbor as yourself, or your fellow as yourself. So I'm going to share my screen with you with a source sheet. The direction of travel that we're going on in terms of revelation is about the revelation of God's self, but from a very particular angle. I'm currently enrolled on a program called Pedagogy's M Squared Institute for Experiential Jewish Education. And I'm a fellow on their program, which is about pedagogies of well-being, or Jewish pedagogies of well-being, exploring how we educate Jewishly towards well-being. And well-being is not happiness, as it was sort of popularized by positive psychology, but it's about how we respond to all of life, both its positives and its negatives, its ups and downs, and how we cope and how we live our lives feeling fulfilled and in a way that allows us to not just thrive but flourish. And we each have the project to explore one aspect of the Jewish pedagogy, and my pedagogy is about giving. It's something I've chosen because for me there's a very clear thread in Judaism about giving, tzedakah, charity we might call it, although I prefer the word tzedakah, and chesed, of loving kindness, acts of loving kindness, and the way that that is both a Jewish idea and also sits within the realms of, if you've seen the NHS guides to 5 things towards 5 ideas towards well-being, giving of oneself is one of those core elements. And we're going to explore now, just for the next few minutes, one aspect of that. But before we do that, let me share my screen and introduce to you a text. I've called this session Divine Facial Recognition. So this is just one revelation. So we begin actually, and the reason why I've chosen this text is because depending on which synagogue you're in, you either read this morning or you're reading it next week. It depends if you're in Israel or the diaspora or liberal or Orthodox, but from Parashat Naso. And it's a very familiar text. Yivarechecha Adonai v'yishmerecha, Ya'er Adonai panav elecha v'yichuneka, Yisa Adonai panav elecha v'yasem lecha shalom. May God bless you and keep you or protect you. May God deal kindly and graciously with you. May God bestow divine favor upon you and grant you peace. I've just seen a message. Someone said it's very small. I don't know how much bigger I can make it. It's pretty big on my screen.
People can make it a bit bigger themselves. If they click on the view options, there's an option that says zoom, and then they could zoom in on it. I don't know if that helps, Betty.
Okay, so well, I'm going to take you through and we'll keep going, and hopefully you can see fairly clearly, and I will be talking to the texts anyway. So this blessing, this priestly benediction that you will probably all be familiar with, that we often read at the end of our services on Shabbat morning, is in the Torah portion for this week, and it has this wonderful poetry of 3 words, 5 words, 7 words. And if you like the film Independence Day, it's repeated by the President of America on Independence Day as they're about to be destroyed by aliens, only they're not. I hope that's not too much of a plot spoiler for a 30-year-old film. And the thing that I wanted to explore with you is what this idea of Ya'er Adonai panav elecha v'chuneka, Yisa Adonai panav elecha v'yasem lecha shalom. Panav is God's face, right? Your punim, your face. So what does it mean that God will enlighten, God's face will enlighten you, or will lift up God's face upon you? And classically, this is understood to be the idea of some kind of divine providence, of protection. That when God shows God's face towards you, it's a sign that you are protected by God. And of course, the reverse, when God's face is hidden, as we see in Psalm 27, this wonderful psalm that we read, actually, some communities read in Elul, the month of Elul. Al taster panecha mimenu, do not hide your face from me. And in fact, the rabbis in the Talmud, just under a couple of thousand years ago, discuss at great length what it might mean to be both those who have God's face shown to them and those who are from the hidden face of God. So those who are amongst the hidden face of God, who effectively are punished or are exposed to negative things in the world. What does this mean? Well, it's clearly a curious phrase that has a biblical sense to it about being protected. But by the time we get to at least the rabbinic period, and certainly in our time, how we understand the idea of God's face being shown towards us or God's face being hidden from us might take on a different idea. And that's where we're going to explore for the next few minutes. So we begin with the Talmud, Bava Batra, and this section of the Babylonian Talmud is a section that deals extensively with charity, with tzedakah, principally because it's exploring the necessary elements of a city, of city life, and what does it mean to have a city, and what does it mean, therefore, to support those who are impoverished within your city. And within the conversation around tzedakah, around charity, we hear this, that Rabbi Elazar, Yehev Pruta La'ani, would give a pruta. A pruta was a tiny, tiny coin. I guess it's probably like a little bit more than one of these, maybe a bit closer to one of these, a 10p. But we'd give a pruta, probably a bit more than a 10p actually, maybe about a pound or a £2 coin in our time, to a poor person. V'hadar, and after that, only then would he pray. He said, as it is written, Ani b'tzedek echezeh fanecha, I will behold your face through charity. So the Talmud tells us here, in fact, it follows on from a brief introduction of the idea that the sages, before they prayed, would give a pruta to charity. And Rabbi Elazar effectively codifies this, not just as an ideal practice, but as something that would be done every time that he prayed. And only after he had given a pruta to charity would he start praying. And the reason being because in tzedek, in righteousness, echezeh, I will behold your face. I will see your face. So what does it mean? First of all, to say I will see your face. That's what we're going to understand and explore. I hope I'll unpack a bit. The revelation of God, divine facial recognition. What occurs from this text, we'll see in a minute about the giving of charity before prayer. But if you've ever been into a synagogue that has a tzedakah box at its doorway, this is the origins. Partly, it's also the origins in the temple, where the first tzedakah box was ever placed in the temple, Solomon's temple. And so Rabbi Elazar would give a pruta to a poor person, and only then would go and pray. And the prayer that he would pray, Mitzaleh, is probably not just the tefillah, it's probably not just the Amidah, the fixed times for prayer, but may indeed have been any time that he was going to pray, he would give this pruta to charity. So, I will behold your face through charity. When I taught this text to a year 5 class, so they're 10, 9 going on 10, we had a long conversation about what it might mean to say that in the act of giving charity, before you pray, you are then able to behold God's face. And maybe that's a question for us to sit with throughout the course of the next few minutes. What does it mean to see God's face only if we give charity first and then go and pray? But let's just carry on, because here's where I'm taking you. Remember our coins? It's very apposite this week that I'm sharing with you a coin, because of course on all of our coins, I think this is a very old image of Her Majesty. Here's a newer one. On all of our coins, we have an image of the monarch. Depending on where you are in the world, I suspect you don't always have a picture of the Queen on your coins, but there we go. So on all of our coins, we have a picture of the monarch. And in Mishnah Sanhedrin, we get a reference to this idea of coins and faces. The Mishnah is dealing, in fact, with the sort of the way that you forewarn the serious consequences of the judicial processes, that if you're going to put someone to death, what that might mean for the judiciary, the responsibility of witnesses and of judges and so on. So the Mishnah has got onto the question of why one person was made at the beginning of creation, and answers this. This is one of their reasons. The first man was created alone. This was done due to the importance of maintaining peace among people, so that one person will not say to another, my father is greater than your father. In other words, if God had made more than one person at the beginning of creation, then one of them would have said, well, mine came first, or your came first, or mine came last and mine was the best. There was only one Adam at the beginning, and so that no one could say anyone else's, theirs was better. And it was also so that the heretics who believe in multiple gods will not say there are many authorities in heaven, and this is all right, so that you only have one image of a human being, like there's only one God. And this is where we're going. And this serves to tell of the greatness of the Holy One, blessed be he. As when a person stamps several coins with one seal, they are all similar to each other. But the supreme King of Kings, the Holy One, blessed be he, stamped all people with the seal of Adam, the first man, as all of them are his offspring, and not one of them is similar to another. Here the Mishnah tells us that when we stamp a coin with the image of a person, they are all the same. But humankind is not like that. We are all imprinted with the seal of the first person of Adam, and yet we are all different. But we're all stamped with that one seal, that God has stamped us all with the one seal of that first person from whom we've all derive our mythical ancestry. So where does this take us? All being stamped with the same image, of course. Which image are we in? Are we made in? Then Azai says these are the generations of Adam. What's the continuation of that verse? Is the fact that we're created in the image of God, is a great principle in the Torah. So the fact that we're created in the image of God is the great principle in the Torah, where Rabbi Akiva says, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Okay, so in other words, Ben Azai and Rabbi Akiva have got two different versions of the kind of these great principles in Torah. Ben Azai says the fact that we're made in the image of God is the great principle, that we're all imprinted with the image of God. And Rabbi Akiva says you shall love your neighbor as yourself is the great principle. And then comes along Rabbi Tanhuma, who says the possibility always is there that if you love your neighbor as yourself, what if you hate yourself? You might mistreat your neighbor. And therefore you need to hold in mind that when you mistreat your neighbor, you do this, know that God made the person you put to shame in his own image. In other words, you put God to shame, you mistreat God. So we're all imprinted with the image of God, and that is why we're drawn back to this text. We're all imprinted with the image of God, and we're all sealed, unlike a coin of a king of flesh and blood, we're all sealed with that imprint of God's face on the coin. So now, God, divine revelation, the facial recognition. Our faces are all imprints of God. We're all in this with a seal of God. And now we're going to go back to Rabbi Elazar. Now, remember Rabbi Elazar used to give a pruta before he prayed. In the Shulchan Aruch, we're told just this: it's good to give tzedakah before prayer. And in another place in the Shulchan Aruch, we're told it is good to give a coin to a poor person before prayer. I leave you with this thought of how does it change our relationship both to tzedakah and to our experience of prayer if we're going to then behold the face of God, if we're giving to a person or we're putting a coin in a box in the synagogue. Hold that question in mind. What's the difference between giving a coin to a person and putting a coin in a box? Underneath this principle is, though, that we will behold God's face in righteousness. Ani b'tzedek echazeh fanecha. So, where have we gone so far? We've encountered Rabbi Elazar, who used to give a coin before he prayed. The coin reminds us that a coin of flesh and blood, of a king of flesh and blood or a queen of flesh and blood, is stamped and is identical in every single way. But we as human beings are stamped with the seal of God, of the first person perhaps, which is in the image of God, and yet none of us are the same. And through our act of giving tzedakah, we are able then, when we pray, to behold God's face. Hopefully you can see these threads coming together, that prayer, the act of praying, the act of encountering God or talking to God, and the act of giving tzedakah are both acts in which we reveal God's face to ourselves and bring God out from being hidden, but in a way that we might not expect. It's not some kind of awesome revelation of God's presence, but it's a reminder that actually we're, as a human family, when we give tzedakah before prayer, we are connected and we're all made in the image of God. I'm going to share just one more text because it's in the name of Rabbi Elazar. Rabbi Elazar discusses the acts of chesed and acts of gemilut chasadim, of deeds of loving kindness. And he goes on to say, the text is here, V'amar Rabbi Elazar, kol ha'oseh tzedakah u'mishpat, ke'ilu milei kol ha'olam kulo chesed, shene'emar, ohev tzedakah u'mishpat, chesed Adonai mal'ah ha'aretz. Rabbi Elazar said, anyone who performs charity and justice, right, a single act of charity and justice, is considered as though he filled the whole world in its entirety with kindness. As it is stated, God loves charity and justice. The earth is full of the kindness of the Eternal One. Rabbi Elazar is someone who is, I would say, consumed with a sense of the significance of doing justice, tzedakah, righteous acts, and doing acts of chesed, and of filling the world with kindness. From the smallest of giving of tzedakah in a box to, or to a person, to the greatest of acts that we can do, acts of charity or acts of chesed. All of them become intrinsic to his understanding of how we encounter God and of how we see God's face. And in a very real sense, that becomes the way that God's face is revealed to us today. That through these acts of charity and through these acts of chesed, through these acts of tzedakah and acts of chesed, we reveal God's face to us. And through that, and just to kind of tie back to where I started, we have an idea that when we give, it makes people happier. Happiness and giving may operate in a positive feedback loop. So this is where I'm going with my wider research and wider work about giving. But the idea that when we give tzedakah, the idea that when we give charity and that when we do acts of chesed, not only are we giving to the recipient, but we're also we're enabling ourselves to see God, and we also giving ourselves a resource to encounter the world more hopefully and more positively, to fill the world ke'ilu milei ha'olam kulo, as if we had filled the entire world with chesed, just with one small act, and possibly even enabled ourselves to encounter God and to see God's face revealed.
Wow. So the notion of divine facial recognition has taken on a complete different flavour for me. Next time I go through passport control or anything else like that, I'm going to look at myself in a different way, as well as hopefully Monique said to me, the person who's on the passport control as well. But absolutely incredible and fascinating. The notion of, you talked about putting threads together, you really did pull threads together in terms of tzedakah and tefillah, and our understanding of how we might achieve that divine facial recognition. Thank you so much indeed. Also, maybe some of us will go off and do our own research into Rabbi Elazar as a rabbi as well as an individual. Absolutely fascinating to hear of him. All I can say as well is that you talked about giving as providing happiness. well, we have received great happiness from you, Rabbi Neil, and hopefully you've received just a little bit by providing it for us as well. Some of you may have not have heard Rabbi Neil teach before, but we haven't had you teach at the Ark before, and I hope we will have the opportunity again, because it really has been an evening of opening up my eyes. If others want to ask questions, please do so. We've got time because Rabbi Neil's been super efficient in the chat as well. I'd really appreciate your questions or thoughts, because a lot has been gone through in the last few moments. I was going to ask Rabbi Eli, and if not Rabbi Eli, maybe Leah, to share the texts that Eli studied as well, so that maybe if people want to go back to it. I know that the website Safaria, Neil, I don't know if you've got a link to, I don't know if your source text is open.
There it is.
Okay, thank you. You can explain a bit more.
Yeah, so well, Safaria is the website that's trying to become the Jewish library for the Jewish people. They're still a little bit in need of work, but they're gradually expanding their resource and providing translations and sources, and you can create source sheets. So the source sheet is there, and everyone is welcome to then view it, and you'll be able to see it, and you can change how you view your settings, whether you view it in with the Hebrew and English side by side, or one above the other. I'd be really happy to take questions. I'm very interested in the idea that as liberal Jews, we tend to only gather together communally for prayer on Shabbat. And if you go to some synagogues, when they do their daily services, someone will come around, or that it's very, we always think of like the silver platter in a church, someone going around collecting money. But if you go to some synagogues, during their daily minyan, daily services, not on Shabbat, someone will come around with the box collecting tzedakah, because it's seen as such a kind of a good thing to do before you pray. And I'm really interested in exploring the idea of what it means as a liberal Jew to have a practice that is at least has a nod to sort of the sense of Shabbat. We all use different things on Shabbat. Some people do and don't use money on Shabbat. But the idea that we would find a way of having a practice as communities that deepens our sense of the connection between the world outside and the people that are in need, and our prayers inside, I'm really fascinated in exploring and creating the bridge more strongly.
I think there's definitely something about that which is sometimes subconscious in those of us who are who are practicing Jews, because I suddenly found myself giving a load of charity this week, and I suddenly, or tzedakah, and I suddenly think, now it's coming to sense that, it's Shavuot, okay, that's why I'm doing this. Maybe you've given me the reason why I was doing it, but the notion that one does that during the week as well as, so it's not just a pilgrim festival kind of thing, but it's also just a regular practice.
Yeah, my teacher, Rabbi Simon Francis, who many of you will remember, Lava Shalom, when I got to my 5th year of rabbinic training at Learbeck College, took me to participate or co-officiate at a funeral, because he was horrified that I had not yet officiated at a funeral by my 5th year of training. And he said, I'm going to teach you 2 important things that you must do in order to do officiate at a funeral. And I thought, I was going to be taken through the prayer book and be told how I should or shouldn't lead things. And when we arrived at the cemetery, I think the cemetery was Cheshunt, but could have been Edgebury. He said, your first task when you arrive at the cemetery is to always have change in your pocket so that you put money in the tzedakah box at the cemetery before you lead the service. And it stuck in my mind very strongly, that this idea that we give charity, we give tzedakah before we participate in acts of prayer. His second advice was, this is a very rabbinic, I know we're amongst friends, this is very rabbinic advice. He said, whenever you do a funeral, the 2 things you must do is give charity when you arrive, and when you go home is on your way, buy a bunch of flowers for your partner, because it will have occurred at possibly a less than convenient moment in your relationship, and you might need to make amends for it on your way home, which was my interpretation of an act of chesed. So it's an act of tzedakah when you arrive, and an act of chesed, of kindness, when you go home.
Absolutely fantastic. And just for those who didn't know Rabbi Simon Francis as well, it's one of the things that as liberal Jews as well, we must bear in mind, because many of our colleagues did come from more traditional backgrounds as well. And Simon certainly so, and from Greece. And we do learn from all peoples. I think Monique opened that up to us as well, about learning from everybody, regardless of backgrounds, and what can we find from each individual. Thank you very much for that. I'm actually off to Athens at the end of the week to do a wedding, so I'm going to be taking Rabbi Simon Francis with me, I think, on my journey. And we'll take that little bit with me as well, and maybe offer a little bit of tzedakah and hopefully a bit of chesed as well along the way.
Your mum's got her hand up.
And Neil, thank you, Neil. If I can just say, I speak to Anne Francis, Rabbi Francis's widow, very regularly, and I will phone her after Shavuot, and I will share that with her, and she will be so touched that you mentioned it today. So thank you, as well as I'll learn from that too. But thank you so much for that. Thank you.
Thanks, Sharon. Send my love.
I will.
So absolutely fantastic. We're going to have to do more of these moments in time. I just want to, Rabbi Neil, thank you so much for your time this evening. For the congregants who are here from South Park's Jewish community, lucky you. Let's do some more sharing of rabbinic resources and everything we bring to each other as well on other occasions.